And you are ready to do some dip glazing, you can come over here to our glaze matrix and look at all the combinations of our different glazes. The way this is set up is this first column is if you dip it in the glaze just once, and then the top row is the same thing. Everything in between is a combination of those two glazes. The way you read this, you can use this card that's on the side, and what's listed in this first column is what you would dip your piece into first, and then what's listed across the top is what you dip it into second. So when you're looking at the glaze board, if this is a glaze that I want, I'm going to dip it in this color first, and then this color. Okay? And these are color coded so that you can see which one goes which. And on the bottom of each of these examples is written almost like a fraction with its initials over the top and under the line. What's written on top is what you would dip it in second. What's written on the bottom is what you dip it in first. So this would be Milky Way with Celadon green over the top of it. Okay? And all of the tiles are labeled in that way. So when you get ready to glaze, come over here to check to see what you want and to see how those glazes would turn out. Typically, there is going to be some variation depending on how well you stir the glaze or where it is in the kiln, but this is pretty good as far as what you're going to get when you glaze and it's fired. So when you're getting ready to dip your piece into the glaze, a couple of different things. One, each glaze has its own bucket, and each color is written on a stir stick because we don't want to contaminate one glaze with another. So for the cup that I'm going to demonstrate your glazing on, I chosen this sample, which is hunter green with speckled blue over it. And when I look at the bottom, I can see speckled blue over hunter green. So this is what I dip first, this is what I dip second. So the two buckets I got are hunter green and speckled blue. Made sure my stir sticks are the correct stir sticks for the color that's in there. And before I dip, I want to make sure my glaze is stirred really well. If I drag the stir stick across the bottom and I can feel that the glaze has settled, and I can feel the material at the bottom kind of stiff, I want to make sure I stir that up so I don't feel any of that at the bottom of the glaze bucket. Okay, so I'm going to stir this up. I'm going to make sure my hunter green is stirred up. If you're glazing a lot of pieces all at once, try to get multiple glazes out and make sure they're all stirred. And you're going to have to continually stir them, not while you're glazing the whole time, but just as chemicals tend to settle out in glazes, so you want to make sure you get them stirred up really well before you dip. Otherwise your color will be really washed out. So my green is stirred up. I'm going to take my cup, and first I'm going to take it by the handle, and I'm going to glaze everything up to the handle. So I'm going to dip it in, making sure the glaze fills the inside of my cup. Hold it there for a couple of seconds, and then pull it out, and I'm going to let it drip until it's dry. So when the glaze comes out, you'll see that it's really shiny, and then as it dries, it kind of becomes chalky. Once it's chalky, then it's dry enough to handle. If it's still wet, if I put my fingers on this, it's going to peel the glaze off. Okay, so make sure your piece is clean and dry before you glaze it, and make sure there isn't any dust on it. If you have any gaps in your glaze, you can always dip your finger in, and then you can just dab a little bit on there to fill in those spots. So you can see now that it's starting to get real chalky on the outside. That's when I know it's okay to handle it. So I can grab the other side, and now I'm just going to dip the handle in to the point where it's already been glazed. And the same thing, I'm going to hold it up so it drips back into the bucket. And then I'm going to set that down to dry here until I'm ready to dip my second color. Now that my cup, the first color of glaze has dried on my cup, I'm ready to dip it in the second one. Before I do that, I went and I took my sponge and I just wiped off any beads of glaze that I had on here. If that glaze was still on here and I went and dipped it in here, suddenly we'd contaminate this glaze with our hunter green glaze, and that would change the way this one turns out. So I just took my sponge, wiped that off, what was there. Now I'm ready to dip, so I want to give this a stir before I dip it in here. Clean off my stir stick so it's not dripping all over the place. In the same way I dipped it the first time. And again, I'm going to hold it upside down so that any excess glaze runs off the rim. When you put your second glaze on, it's going to take a little bit longer for the glaze to dry on the surface because the piece has absorbed the moisture from the first coat of glaze. That's going to take it a little bit longer to dry on the second coat. So you really want to make sure it's dry and it's completely chalky before you touch it with your fingers, because if I were to touch it now, I'd smear the glaze that's on there or I'd peel it off. Okay. So now that it's stopped dripping, I'm going to turn it up right side up, and I'm just going to set it down until it's dry. And it'll probably be a couple of minutes. I can go glaze some other stuff while I'm waiting for that one to dry. So my cup is mostly dried. I can touch it on the bottom. You can see it's a little bit darker at the top than it is at the bottom. So that's how I know the top is still a little wet and I don't want to touch it. But I'm okay to handle it down here. It's not going to peel off or anything. So taking my cup, I'm going to glaze just the handle again like I did before. Okay, I'm going to let the excess drip off. Give it a little shake to get those drops off. And then, like before, I'm just going to take my sponge and I'm going to wipe off the excess glaze that's on the bottom. Because if I leave this on, that's going to stick to the kiln shelf, and which will break the bottom of your cup when I go to unload the kiln after it's been fired. So make sure you wipe that off with the sponge before you set it in to be fired again. And that's how you dip your glazes. So the other type of glazing that we can do is underglazing. Underglazing is working more with like a paint type thing. What underglaze is, they're kind of like colored slips that you put on after the clay has been, usually after the clay has been fired once. You can put it on while the clay is still drying, but you don't necessarily get as even coverage as you would after it's been bisque fired. So we're gonna, most of the pots we make, I'm gonna bisque fire them before you underglaze them. And again, make sure the surface of your pot is free of any dust and it's clean when you go to underglaze. Choose the colors that you want. With underglazes, the color that's in the jar is the color that you're going to get when it's fired, unless you cover it with a different color. To make these food safe, we'll put a clear glaze on it, but the color you see is the color that you're going to get, as opposed to our dip glazes where the color changes once it's been exposed to heat. So once you choose your color, make sure the lid is on tight, and then you want to shake it because these settle out. And you want to shake it until it sounds like it's well mixed, and you don't have any big globs of underglaze that are kind of stuck in there. So after I've shaken it up a little bit, just going to open the top. And the first thing I'm going to do when I start to brush this on is I'm going to use the glaze that's in the lid. So take a regular brush, a regular paint brush, which is over by the underglazes, and I can just brush this on nice and even onto my pot. When I do this, I want to be careful to get nice even coats of underglaze. It'll probably take you 2 to 3 coats to cover and get good color. If you put them on too quickly, or if you only put one coat on, it's not going to cover really well, and the color of the pot itself is going to start to show through, and you want to kind of avoid that. So once I've used the glaze out of the lid, then I'm going to just take it out of the jar. Again, I'm not going to dip my whole brush in. I'm going to leave some of the bristles clean, or the tops of the bristles clean, so I don't get underglaze up in the metal part of my brush. And I'm going to do my first coat over the whole thing so it's nice and even. Your first coat, you're going to notice, dries really quickly because the fired clay absorbs the moisture and water out of your glaze. So once the first coat is dry, then you can start adding your second coat. Your second coat's going to dry a little bit slower because the clay has already absorbed some of that moisture, and it doesn't necessarily absorb the water as fast out of the glaze. I want to make sure I get every part of this where I want it, even inside my handle. And make sure it's even. Okay. Now where I started over here, this is dry already, so I can go ahead and I can start my second coat already. I'm not going to brush it too much. I'm just going to make sure it's brushed on and it's brushed on evenly. If I continue to brush back and forth where I applied it, all I'm going to do is start to move some of the glaze that's already on there, some of the underglaze that's already on there. And I don't want to remove any. I want to create layers of underglaze. Your lighter colors of underglaze will probably be a little bit thinner. So like, because I'm using yellow, I'll definitely need to do 3 coats, and then based on what that third coat looks like, I may choose to do a 4th coat, but I want to make sure it's evenly applied across the whole piece before I do that. Okay. So what you see is what you get. The other nice thing with underglazes is that you have a little bit of flexibility in how you can work with them. So once I've added this, I could paint designs onto my cups. So for example, this cup I've had some indentations, or whatever piece you're doing. It can be bowls, it can be coil pots, or your tiki heads or whatever. I can tape off sections, and this tape will act as a resist, so that where these indentations are, I could paint, or I could brush on a different color. And create some different effects. So the underglazes will work a lot like paint does. So you could actually do patterns and designs on the sides of your pots, and use different colors to create those. And then all we would have to do to make it food safe, so for like these cups, in order to make them functional, all we would have to do then is add a clear overglaze to it that would then make it food safe. So I've taped off the top stripe that I had carved into this cup, and I'm going to paint this bright color on there. Again, making sure my top was on tight, I'm going to shake it to make sure it's stirred up really well. Again, I'm going to take the color out of my lid before I take it out of the mill, just so that I don't get drips down my bottle. I'm going to brush this on to the area that I have taped off. And then, just like our regular underglaze, I'm going to have to do multiple coats of this color. So I'm going to leave the tape on. Again, my first coat is going to dry really quickly, so that I can go and put my second coat on right away. And because this is a lighter color, again, it doesn't cover as well. So I'm going to have to do more coats. And then as I put more coats on, I'm going to wait between each one a little bit longer before I begin the next one. So I can start my second one pretty quickly. But now the third one, I'm going to have to wait a little bit to start that because this is going to take a little bit longer to dry. The other nice thing is if this gets under the tape at all, any color I put on after this will cover up what's already there. As long as I put 3 coats of it on, you can cover up what color's there. So if I wanted to paint a pattern on this green chartreuse color, if I were to do like diamond shapes or whatever, I can go in, I can paint that over what's already here. So there's a lot of versatility with underglazes. One of the nicest things that people like the most about underglaze is that the color that you see is the color you're going to get. There's not a lot of guesswork. It's pretty consistent how it turns out every time. You just got to make sure your pot that you're putting it on is free of dust and that it doesn't have a lot of moisture in it yet, so that the underglaze will really adhere to it well.